Guess who got brands talking? Brandlive.co.za.
You're listening to Inside OUTA with Lois Moodley.
Hi and welcome to Inside OUTA. I'm your regular anchor, Lois Moodley, OUTA's head of communications. Last month, OUTA CEO Wayne Duvenage co-hosted the show with me, and he was speaking to Pravin Gordhan, Public Enterprises Minister. This time around, in the Thought Leadership Corner, he'll be connecting with veteran social justice activist and Section27's Executive Director, Mark Heywood. In the Portfolio Manager Progress Report featured today, I'll be connecting with OUTA locals Michael Holenstein. But before that, over to Wayne and Mark.
You're listening to Inside OUTA with Lois Moodley and Wayne Duvenage.
Hi, good day to our listeners. I'm happy to be joined in the studio today by Mark Heywood, Section27's Mark Heywood. Mark, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. It's a privilege. Thank you for having me.
No, lovely, man. I just want to reflect on when I first met you. It was about 5-6 years ago. And the ETAL matter had started. I'd come out of corporate life, and I had to quickly learn what real civil activism is about. And somebody said, go and meet with people like Hugh Glenister, Mark Heywood, and a number of others. And so we set up a meeting, and at that stage, this ETAL matter was getting quite big. It was far bigger than I thought it would get to. Wasn't really ready for it, and tried to sort of pass this rugby ball over to you, I remember, and you made a very profound statement at the time. You listened very well, and then you said, this is a big civil issue, Wayne, and you've started this fight, and you have to see it through to the end. You can't start these things and get out of it. And that resonated so well and was a big lesson for me. How's that panned out for you? Because you've been in this game for a long time now.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I'd say is civil activism is as old as history.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if you look at history, you will very often find that it was organized people that brought all the important changes that society has seen all over the world, and particularly all the important progressive changes and changes around justice. So, in terms of my own experience and history, I didn't really have a plan that I was going to go into what we now call civil society.
Mm-hmm.
But once I started work after 1994 with the AIDS Law Project, which was an NGO fighting around rights of people living with HIV, what I discovered is that, one campaign leads to another, one victory leads to another. It's a process of climbing steps, and it's very, very difficult. And I find sort of almost morally unconscionable to start something and then get halfway through it and step out.
Yeah.
It's not that it depends upon you as an individual, but you as an individual, particularly when you take a position of leadership, can make a very, very important contribution. And as you know, Wayne, it's intellectually challenging, it's politically challenging, it's you get a lot out of it when you see change that benefits other people.
But it also saps you from time to time.
Well, it does. It saps you greatly. So part of being an activist is that you have to have strategies as to how you manage the way that it drains you emotionally and physically.
Resilience is another word
resilience,
that comes. Yeah.
I'm a marathon runner. I always say that, I take what I learned from running marathons and transplant it into running the life marathon of change.
I see that, and you're cycling and you're keeping fit, both mentally, keeping the country fit and on its toes as well. And it's been some time when the AIDS Law Project started. Take us back to that.
Well, the AIDS Law Project was actually set up in about 1992 by now Constitutional Court Judge Edwin Cameron.
Right.
And he set it up because he was quite prescient, he was quite farsighted, he could see what was coming with the AIDS epidemic. In the early 1990s, very few people even believed that there was this big epidemic in the wings. But he also saw that there was going to be a wave of discrimination and injustice that would go with the AIDS epidemic because of the stigma around HIV. I joined in 1994. I'd been a political activist since my student years, in fact, before my student years. Not really knowing what AIDS was about. In fact, having very little even of a kind of medical scientific understanding of HIV and AIDS. But once I got in, it was due to be for a short time. I thought I was going to go and teach English literature or African literature at Wits. That was my plan at that point. I thought it would be for a short time. But then once I got in, I realized how big the issue was. And that began a kind of journey, if you like.
And it's been a long journey and a very fruitful one, a successful one, and it's transformed into so many things along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the AIDS Law Project existed until 2010. In 2010, colleagues of mine at the AIDS Law Project said, listen, the name we've outgrown the name AIDS Law Project because we were doing so many other things that were about health. So we created Section 27 out of the AIDS Law Project in 2010, and we're now 7 years into Section 27. But, along the way, as you know from your experience with OUTA, you create other organizations, sometimes networks, sometimes movements. So with the AIDS Law Project, for example, in the late 1990s, one of the things that we realized was a bunch of kind of legal professionals, middle-class professionals, predominantly white, predominantly middle class, weren't going to be the movement that would change the course of government in relation to AIDS, that there really needed to be a social movement made up of ordinary people that reflected the gender of the epidemic, that reflected the racial demographics of the epidemics, and that was what became the Treatment Action Campaign.
Okay.
So there's many a twist and turn as you go along this road.
And I guess as you set these different initiatives up, they pull you in different directions. You got to regroup. Otherwise you start your mandates, your journey changes quite rapidly, huh?
Yeah, it's a constant process of self-evaluation, evaluation of the organization, of the strategies. Are the strategies working? What you're doing resonating with people? Does it make sense? Are you succeeding in the courts? If you're succeeding in the courts, is what you win in court being turned into change in the streets and in government policies? So, it's an art, Wayne, as I think you know. But often people look at NGOs and the so-called civil society sector and they kind of think that it's a sort of lazy thing that people who can't succeed in business or can't succeed in government get into it. But it's a profession, but it has a very different ethic. It has what should be government's ethic and what should be business's ethic, which is an ethic, I think, of sacrifice, of hard work, of public service, which you don't find enough in business and government. I think if you don't have that in the space we work in, then what we're trying to do collapses, because not least because you have to go and beg people to give you money, and you have to say to them, you give us money because we're going to make the change. If they start to see you taking the money and pocketing it for self-interest, then the game's over.
Absolutely. So it's that integrity.
Yeah.
You spoke just now a little bit about the courts and the law, and that's a question I wanted to get to, so we get into that now. The without good law, without good courts and a legal and judicial system, I think we'd struggle a lot more. Yet it's so difficult to get stuff done. The cost and then rulings aren't always adhered to. What are your views around the effectiveness of civil society's use of courts?
The first thing is, I think courts are vitally important, but they're not the only arrow in our armory or whatever to mix up metaphors. We often use courts when we've failed, when Parliament is not receptive to arguments around policy change, when the executive is misbehaving. It's when other strategies fail. We always say that you use courts almost as a last resort. Yeah. Now, we're very fortunate in this country because of our constitutional separation of powers with the cabinet, legislature, and the courts. So we've been failed for the last decade at least by cabinet and parliament. We've had to place a big reliance on the courts. In my experience, the courts have only failed once.
Yeah.
And we'll come to that in relation to Esidimeni. I've never lost a court
Mm.
case, or my organizations have never lost a court case.
Yeah.
But again, there's an art.
Yeah.
You've got to know how to use the courts in a way that you don't get bogged down in legal process and procedure. You can't go into court cases that are going to drag out over years and years when issues that require solutions that need to be found in months or a couple of years at the best. It's very important that you use courts, but you don't lift the issue. By doing that, you're not taking the issue away from the people that need the courts. So there's a lot to be said about it. But I often say, I think our best example of using the courts is the use we made with the treatment action campaign, where we took an issue which was access to antiretroviral treatment. At the point we went to the courts, everybody who got AIDS died of AIDS. Today, probably 15 years later, there's 4.5 million people on antiretroviral treatment living with AIDS, and that started with a court case. And the point I make is that we did that with AIDS, but I think you could do that with access to sufficient food. I think you can do it with basic education. I think you can do it with what OUTA is working on around corruption and accountability and good governance and so on. So very, very important tools, but just one tool in the toolbox.
And from that, one gets a sense of the complexity, and that there's no textbook. This is not something, civil activism, it's not a one glove or one shoe fits all. This is about adapting to the situation and being extremely vigilant and exploring and finding new ways to tackle the issue. And so that you've painted that quite clearly there. We're going to take a break, and then we'll be back after this.
Demand good governance. Join us weekly on Inside OUTA.
Harnessing the power of talk radio. brandlive.co.za.
Engage in active citizenry. Join us weekly on Inside OUTA.
Thank you. Back again, chatting with Mark Heywood, one of the modern day founders of effective civil intervention in South Africa, a hero to so many people whose lives he's touched and changed through the work that the various organizations that he's worked for has done. And through a lot of the work, Section27, Mark, has also evolved, and you tend to focus a lot on health and education issues. And these are two fundamental pillars to society which have collapsed in South Africa. Share with us some of the successes, some of the focus areas in both of those two sectors.
Well, yeah, health and education, because they're both vital for people's dignity. They're both vital for millions and millions of people who strive to be citizens. They're both vital for equality. Health is a complex area. There's so much involved in health. And we find ourselves drawn into everything from ensuring access to emergency medical services and ambulances to continued issues around supply of medicines for TB and antiretrovirals. Increasingly now we're getting drawn into issues around abortion and termination of pregnancy. There are big policy questions. You'll probably ask about national health insurance. And again, it's it's about how do you realize this right. And on education, important thing to say, Wayne, is that in our constitution, the way our constitution treats education is different from the way it treats health. So health, the government is under an obligation to progressively improve the quality of healthcare services, whereas with education, the government is under a duty to immediately provide good quality education to all children in this country. Immediately provide. And I can see you and others thinking, well, then what happened?
Yeah, what's broken?
Why do we have such a disaster? And I think we have such a disaster because government has not understood or taken seriously that obligation. But the point is that because it's under this whip, if you like, if only people use that whip on government to say, my kid has a right to go to a school with a safe and a clean toilet and a desk and a textbook and a teacher and a fence around the school and everything that makes a school run well, then maybe it would be people power that would bring about a quality basic education system. And we've been working on education now for 7 years. We're a long way from succeeding with the vision I've just described, but I do believe we're getting there. I kind of think we're getting to a tipping point where this country might start to demand, say, that what you have given us in a public education system is not acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so shocking 20 years, 25 years later that we're seeing the regressive numbers and pass rates, and we're producing unemployable people, and that's a sad situation to be in.
And that's what people don't understand. And again, it links to what OUTA does, is they don't understand how the crisis of basic education now, the terrible outcomes. There was a research report released just a few weeks ago that showed that 78% of children at grade 4, which is I think age 8 or 9, can't read to learn. 78% can't read to learn, and
that is an indictment.
That's an indictment. But not only does that just ruin lives and ruin opportunity, but it affects the shape of our state for years to come.
Our economy,
so
everything.
what it means is we have to staff our government departments or our police service or our hospital service with consultants and imported bureaucracies who are not accountable, who are more prone to corruption, as we've seen with the Mackenzie's role in ESCOM and so on. So it has huge governance implications if you don't get something as apparently simple as education right.
We've got a lot of work to do there, without a doubt, and it's frightening almost. But I think this is the thing about, I was chatting earlier today with one of our colleagues, one can be overwhelmed, one can be almost, where do you start? But civil activism is being focused and not being overwhelmed and eating this elephant one step at a time. You mentioned earlier Esidimeni, that was tragic. What happened, Mark?
It's hard to say in a few minutes, but essentially you had a provincial government health department that had become corrupted, that had become unanswerable to people. It was led by an MEC who kind of took her message, if you like, signal from Jacob Zuma, so treated with people with contempt. They didn't listen to the scientists, they didn't listen to the doctors who said don't close it down, they didn't listen to the people who said this would be a disaster. And as Justice Moseneke, who was the arbitrator in the arbitration, said, they acted with ulterior motives. So their motives had nothing to do with money saving or good health practice. And we don't really know. You say what happened. Well, we don't really know, but I suspect, and I think if the police do their job, this will be confirmed, that actually there was a corrupt motive. It was almost like we've got 3,000 mentally ill people. We've got a facility. If we close the facility down, effectively we can sell those people. And from giving those people to NGOs, we can divert money back to ourselves. We can consolidate relations of patronage with people who will vote for the ANC in this instance. That's...
So a cocktail of maladministration, of ineptitude, of corruption, of just not caring for the people they serve, all coming out in death, families ruined. That's a classic example of how seriously things go wrong when government just doesn't serve the people in the best interests of the people.
That's right. And it was what's not unusual about it is that it's happening every day. It just doesn't happen on that scale. The consequences aren't 144 deaths. But people are dying on a daily basis because of this cocktail of maladministration. But they're poor people and nobody notices.
Mark, on the National Health Insurance, a sensitive topic because we need to do something about healthcare for the poor. We really have to. And yet this again seems to be government going down a journey of policy making that is fraught or just filled with gross inefficiencies. It's going to collapse. What are your views there?
Yeah, look, it'll either not get started or it'll collapse. I think it's more likely to not get started because what's on the table at the moment with the National Health Insurance Bill is just essentially creating a massive new institution, bureaucratic institution, to purchase health funds and to supply healthcare services that the state just doesn't have the funds or the competence or the capability to put together. It's also problematic because it's going about the problem of health in this country from the wrong starting point. The correct starting point would be there are 2 points from which we should be starting simultaneously, if that's possible. One is fixing the public healthcare system, and there are ways to do that. And we still have one of the best public health systems of any developing country in the world, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And the second is sorting out the private healthcare system. And we've got to do both.
Yeah.
You know, we look at public, and all of your listeners know the crisis in the public healthcare system. We don't look enough at private. Now, fortunately, with private, we also have a roadmap. We've just had this very, very important Competition Commission instigated inquiry into the private healthcare market. They've produced a 450-page report that has analyzed the private healthcare market, that has confirmed a lot of what we all suspect, which is that we're being ripped off, that we're being overcharged, that we're being overserviced, those of us who use private medical care. Now, if we sorted those things out, then created some greater parity between the public platform and the private platform, then we have a basis for universal healthcare, to build a national health insurance system on. That's what we need to be doing.
You know, so many similarities to this and the ETOL matter. On paper, it all looks good, and government has this view that if it passes laws and policies, well, then everybody just follows. And then you look back and they say, well, what happened? Well, they just didn't listen to their critics, didn't pay enough attention on research, and that's frustrating for you, eh? It's frustrating for activists.
Yeah, it's very frustrating, and it's very frustrating that we have a government that, you know, by most accounts is a progressive government, but that just doesn't take evidence seriously, doesn't take the goodwill that's out there. You know, like you and us, I often say to people, civil society is not anti-government, inherently anti-government. Civil society is actually pro-government.
Good
we
governance.
Want good government. We want strong, effective government. We want partnerships.
Fantastic, Mark. Look, I was just wrapping up. It's been an amazing journey for you, and your book, Get Up, Stand Up, is a testament and a reflection of where you've gone, how deep you've gone into all of this. What are your reflections? But a highlight in your journey. I know there's so much, and your message to people who have to realize that this is a space we need to play in as citizens in this country.
The reason for writing that book was quite simple, which is just to say to people that you've got to get up and you've got to stand up and you've got to take responsibility, not just for yourself, but for your society. And I say that with some, you know, fear, because I think that we're in a world now where if people don't get up and stand up, then we're going to be facing all sorts of disasters at a national and an international level. But the second message, which is something that can also change, is that at the moment we have a lot of power. In South Africa, we have a lot of power because of our constitution, our legal framework. Use that power. Use the democratic means that are available to you to shape the type of country that you want. So I told that tale, and I partly tried to humanize it with my experience of a lifetime of activism, to show people actually it's quite fun.
It is.
Serving people can be quite fun.
It's rewarding.
It's
uplifting.
It's rewarding and it's uplifting, and I have not one moment's regret of all the time that I've spent doing this, even though at the end of it, I don't have a big house and I don't have a fleet of cars and I don't have a...
You've invested your life, and I don't think people actually understand and give recognition enough to what people like you have done. So Mark, I want to say thank you very much for joining us, the wisdom that you have and shared with us today, and to our listeners, get that book, Get Up, Stand Up, at the bookstores, written by Mark Heywood, a truly inspiring individual that is making a difference in this country. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you, Wayne. It's very kind. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Live from 27 boxes in the heart of Melville, this is brandlive.co.za.
Yeah. Oh. true colors. Baby, see true colors. Get down, baby, you running. Can't make you turn it. Oh, got me for your true colors. I see your true colors. Baby, your true colors. You flexing on me right now. Oh, baby, true colors. I'm talking about you, true colors. Oh, no, no, girl, talking about true colors. Oh, no, I'm talking about true colors. We're sipping all day, all night, baby girl, you true colors. Yeah, cause we are rolling. Cop on me. Shots in the back, I'm on it. You on me. Baby, come in true colors. True, baby, true colors. True, yeah, I'm talking true colors.
Harnessing the power of talk radio. brandlive.co.za.
You're listening to Inside OUTA with Lois Moodley.
Welcome to the Inside Outer Progress Report. In this feature, we are joined by one of our portfolio managers each week to get an update on the work that they're doing, whether it be related to transport, water and environment, energy, local government, or special projects. On the line today is OUTA Local Portfolio Manager Michael Holenstein. Michael, thank you for joining us. You recently visited Mfuleni, where there has been some concerns about the state of local governance there. Please, can you give our listeners a sense of what's happening in Mfuleni?
Yes, good afternoon, Lois, and to all your listeners. Lois, unfortunately, the state of affairs in Mfuleni are quite... the sewage system has all but collapsed. Most of the pump stations are faulty and not operational. There is raw sewage flowing into the Bol River, into the Klip River, and into other water courses. And in fact, I got a call from a school down there, and there's raw sewage that is flowing out of a leaking pipe onto the playing fields of the school and about 10 or 15 meters away from the classrooms. And in actual fact, the principal closed the school because obviously there's a health hazard, and it could obviously, negatively affect some of the learners at the school.
And say, especially for young children. Can you hear me, Michael? Hello?
I can hear you.
Alrighty. Huge health concerns there in Mfuleni. If others in other communities are concerned about the state of their municipalities, how do communities or community members request the opening of an OUTA local branch?
Well, what normally happens is it's a situation of utter desperation. And because of the good work that OUTA has been doing, and e-tolls, etc., they basically require a vehicle to assist them to hold the local officials and politicians to account. We've had numerous calls from probably 60 or 65 communities in various municipalities across the country over the last couple of months, and the situation is really, really dire at local government level.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you would like to know more about the work that OUTA Local is doing, please visit our website, www.outa.co.za, and check out our social media pages.
Thanks for listening to Inside OUTA. Tune in next week when we delve deeper into undoing tax abuse.
Live from 27 boxes in the heart of Melville, this is brandlive.co.za.